მოგესალმებით, პირველ რიგში მივესალმებით ჩვენს სტუმრებს, ცნობილ ამერიკელ მწერლებს, თარგმნელებს და რაც ჩვენთვის ყველაზე საინტერესო გამოცდილება ალბათ გასაზიანებლად საუნივერსიტეტო სივრცეში, ცნობილ უნივერსიტეტში, აიანაში, ტეხასში, პიტსბურგში საერთაშორისო სამწერლობო პროგრამის კოორდინატორებს და ამ პროგრამის შემქმნელებს. ჩვენთვის განსაკუთრებით საინტერესოა ის, რომ ჩვენს დღევანდელ სტუმრებს, ბატონ კრისტოფერ მერილიდან დავიწყებდი, აქ ძალიან დიდი გამოცდილება ერთის მხრივ სამწერლობო ველზე მუშაობის, ბალკანეთის ხანგრძლივი ომის 10 წლიანი მოგზაურობის შედეგების რეფლექსია, ლიტერატურული რეფლექსია და შემდეგ უკვე ამ ლიტერატურული რეფლექსიის საუნივერსიტეტო სივრცეში, საუნივერსიტეტო პროგრამებში ადაპტირება. ეს, მე ვხედავ ჩვენი ლიტერატურის მიმართულების პროფესორებს და ვფიქრობ, რომ განსაკუთრებით საინტერესოა. ასეთივე გამოცდილება აქვს ჩვენ სხვა სტუმრებს, ენჯი, კრუზი, აიანა, მათისი, როზა, ალკალას. ჩვენთვის როგორც ლინგვისტისთვის განსაკუთრებული საინტერესოა მათი მთარგმნელობითი გამოცდილება, ემოციები, რომლებიც ერთი ენიდან მეორეში მოგზაურობენ, ემოციები, რომლის შესახებ ტრანსლატოროლოგიაში ძალიან ხანგრძლივი დისკუსიებია, რომ ეს ემოციები რეალურად ითარგმნელია, ჩემთვისაც ძალიან საინტერესო იქნება ამის მოსმენა ჩვენი კოლეგებისგან. ასევე ძალიან დიდი მადლობა მინდა ვუთხრა დღევანდელი შეხვედრის ორგანიზატორებს, ინიციატორებს, სახელმწიფო დეპარტამენტის განათლებისა და კულტურის ბიუროს და ჩვენს უცვლელ პარტნიორს ამერიკის შეერთებული შტატების საელჩოს საქართველოში, რომელთანაც ერთად ჩვენ არაერთი მათ შორის ლიტერატურული პროექტი განვახორციელეთ. უკანასკნელი იყო მაისის თვეში, საქართველოს დამოუკიდებლობის თვეში. ეხლა მე სანამ გადავცემ სიტყვას ჩვენი დღევანდელი შეხვედრის მოდერატორს, რომელიც ასევე გახლავთ ილიას სახელმწიფო უნივერსიტეტში ფულბრაიტის პროგრამის მკვლევარი, მე მინდა რამდენიმე სიტყვით ჩვენ საზოგადოებასთან შევჩერდე იმ განსაკუთრებულ როლზე, რაც ამერიკის სახელმწიფო თუ კერძო ფონდებს ამ ქვეყნის მათ შორის ლიტერატურული მემკვიდრეობის შენარჩუნების, დოკუმენტირებისა და მისი თანამედროვე მდგომარეობის შესწავლის საქმეში მიუძღვის. სხვათა შორის, ეს წვლილი ისე ზოგჯერ ისეა, რომ თითქოს მეორე პლანზე გადადის გასაგები მიზეზების გამო, იმიტომ რომ ამ ქვეყნის სტრატეგიულ განვითარებაში მისი სამხედრო უსაფრთხოების, სახელმწიფოებრივი მოწყობის თუ სტრატეგიული უსაფრთხოების საკითხებში იმდენად დიდია ამ ქვეყნის წვლილი, რომ გასაგებია, რომ თქვათ კულტურასა და განათლებაში ამ ქვეყნის კერძო და სახელმწიფოებრივი ფონდების წვლილი თითქოს მეორე პლანზე გადადის. მე გაგახსენებთ, აქ არიან ჩემი თაობის მეცნიერები, მკვლევრები და ავტორები, რომ ამ მწვანე ნავთქურის 90-იან წლებში ის რომ ამ ქვეყნის კულტურული მემკვიდრეობა, მათ შორის ლიტერატურული მემკვიდრეობა მსოფლიო დონის ფიზიკურად გადარჩა, ეს არის სწორედ ამერიკული ფონდების დამსახურება. იცით რა იყო პირველი პროექტი, ერთ-ერთი პირველი პროექტი ამერიკის შეერთებული შტატებისა საქართველოში, ხელნაწერთა ეროვნულ ცენტრში, რომელშიც ინახება უძველესი ქართული და ამასთანავე ებრაული, ბერძნული, სირიული, სომხური, არაბული, სპარსული ხელნაწერები დაამონტაჟეს თბორეგულაციის სისტემა. და ის რომ იმ ბნელ 90-იან წლებში, როცა ჩვენთან თბორეგულაციამდე საქმე მართლაც არ მიდიოდა, ის რომ ის ხელნაწერები უმდიდრესი მემკვიდრეობა, მათ შორის პაპირუსები, ძველი წელთაღრიცხვის მე-7 საუკუნის პაპირუსები, ჩვენ არ ჩაგვეფშვნა ხელში და არ იქცა მტვრად და შეინარჩუნა ტენის შეთვისების უნარი. ეს არის სწორედ ჩვენი სტრატეგიული პარტნიორების ამერიკული ფონდების დამსახურება, დაწყებული ჯვრის მონასტრიდან დავით გარეჯის და სამხრეთ საქართველოს ძეგლების ჩათვლით, ყველაფერი მართლა სტრატეგიულად მნიშვნელოვანი რესტავრაციის პროექტი სწორედ ამერიკული, რა თქმა უნდა, ასევე ევროპული ფონდების მიერ არის დაფინანსებული. მე მახსოვს, როდესაც იგივე საელჩოსთან ერთად ჩვენ გვქონდა შეხვედრები 2011-12 წლებში და თვითონ აკეთებდნენ, ასე ვთქვათ, ყველაზე გადაუდებელი საკითხების იდენტიფიცირებასაც, მაგალითად, ცნობილის უფლისციხის კლდეები, ანუ უფლისციხის კომპლექსი, რომელიც დგას კლდეებზე და იმ კლდეების შენარჩუნება რამდენად მნიშვნელოვანია, რომ მონიტორინგის სისტემა ჩვენი უნივერსიტეტის კვლევითი ჯგუფის ხელმძღვანელობით იქ დამონტაჟდა მონიტორინგის სისტემა. ანუ ეს არის უწყვეტი პროცესი იმ დღიდან დაწყებული, რაც ამერიკის შეერთებული შტატების ოფიციალური წარმომადგენლობა ჩამოვიდა საქართველოში და წელს 30 წელი ხდება და ამიტომაც ჩვენთვის განსაკუთრებით მნიშვნელოვანია ამის აღნიშვნა. ამ პროცესს ქართული და მსოფლიო უძველესი ლიტერატურული მემკვიდრეობის შენახვისთვის, გადარჩენისთვის, მისი საერთაშორისო სამეცნიერო მიმოქცევაში ჩართვისთვის დაწყებულ იმ პროექტებს და დღევანდელ შეკრებას, რომელიც თანამედროვე ქართველი მწერლების, თანამედროვე ქართველი მკითხველის, მათ შორის ჩვენი სტუდენტების შეხვედრას და მათ შორის ურთიერთობების გაღრმავებას ეთმობა ჩვენ აღვიქვამთ ერთ დიდ პროცესად და ეს პროცესი არის სწორედ ჩვენი ქვეყნის პოსტსაბჭოთა საქართველოს ინტეგრაცია თანამედროვე დასავლურ სტრუქტურებთან. იცით, კულტურისა და განათლების სფეროში ჩვენ გაცილებით უფრო მეტი, ასე ვთქვათ, პუნქტი გვაქვს შესასრულებელი, ვიდრე ის ამ ევროინტეგრაციის პროცესში ახლა რაც დაგვისახეს, ის 12 პუნქტი, ეს არის გაცილებით უფრო დიდი. ჩვენ აქ მოგვიწევს დღეს თანამედროვე ქართულ საზოგადოებას, მათ შორის ქართულ ლიტერატურას კაფიოდ ავხსნათ, რომელი მემკვიდრეობის ასე ვთქვათ, შთამომავლები ვართ. იმ მართლაც მსოფლიო კულტურული მემკვიდრეობისა, რომ მე-12 საუკუნეში ცნობილმა ქართველმა, უდიდესმა ქართველმა მწერალმა შოთა რუსთაველმა, რომ ასე ვთქვათ, კონცეპტუალური ფრაზა დაგვიტოვა, რომ ჩვენ კაცთა მოგვცა ქვეყანა გვაქვს უთვალავის ფერითა. ამისი მემკვიდრეობები ვართ, რას ნიშნავს ამისი მემკვიდრეობა დღეს? როგორ რეფლექსირებს თანამედროვე ქართული მწერლობა იმ საკითხებზე, კულტურული, ენობრივი, ეთნიკური, რელიგიური მრავალფეროვნების საკითხებზე, რაზეც ჩვენი დღევანდელი სტუმრები მუშაობენ. გვაქვს ჩვენ დააზრებული, რომ ვართ ამ თვალსაზრისით თანამედროვე დასავლური მსოფლიოს ნაწილი, გსურს იგივე ტიპის აფროამერიკული კვლევების ანალოგი დავაარსოთ საქართველოში. ვიცით, არაქართულენოვანი, არა ძირითადი რელიგიური აღმსარებლობის მქონე მოსახლეობის წვლილი, როგორ უნდა იყოს კონცეპტუალიზებული ჩვენს ისტორიაში. ფიქრობთ ამაზე, ამისი ფიქრის, განსჯის და რეფლექსიის უმთავრესი ადგილი არის უნივერსიტეტი, ამიტომ მე ძალიან მადლობელი ვარ ჩვენი პარტნიორების, ამერიკის შეერთებული შტატების საელჩოსი, სახელმწიფო დეპარტამენტის კულტურისა და ლიტერატურის ბიუროსი, რომ გვაძლევს შესაძლებლობას როგორც იმ ხელნაწერების დოკუმენტირების და შენახვის პროექტის, ასევე ამ თანამედროვე დისკუსიის პროექტისთვის მოგვცეს შესაძლებლობა და მოგვცეს შესაძლებლობა იმისა, რომ ჩვენ თანამედროვე მსოფლიოს ვარჩვენოთ, რომ დიახ, ჩვენ იმ კულტურის მატარებლები ვართ, კულტურისა, რომელმაც შუა საუკუნეებში არა მარტო საერო ლიტერატურაში თქვა, ამ თვალსაზრისით თავისი სიტყვა იგივე მრავალფეროვნება, არამედ თუნდაც სასულიერო ლიტერატურაში, იცით, ჩემი საყვარელი გამოთქმა ძველი ქართული სასულიერო მწერლობიდან, როდესაც ერთ-ერთი უცნობი ავტორი მე-12 საუკუნისა საუბრობს უცხოსა და შინაურის რეფლექსიაზე და ასეთ რამეს ამბობს, რომ მათ შორის ზღვარი რაღაც დროს იშლება და ჩვეულება ნამეტნავი სხვათა ჟამად და ჟამად ნებად ბუნებითაც შეიქმნების, ანუ თუ წესად. მე დიდი იმედი მაქვს, რომ ჩვენი დღევანდელი სტუმრები სწორედ ამის გააზრებაში, ამის რეფლექსიაში, ლიტერატურულ რეფლექსიაში და ჩვენ საუნივერსიტეტო საგანმანათლებლო პროგრამაში ასახვაში დაგვეხმარებიან. კიდევ ერთხელ დიდი მადლობა მათ, კიდევ ერთხელ დიდი მადლობა ამ შეხვედრის ორგანიზატორებს და კოორდინატორებს. მადლობა.
Thank you very much for that introduction. My name is Nilufar Talebi, and I'm the Fulbright U.S. Scholar here for the year 2021 and 2022. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon and welcome our distinguished American colleagues and writers here to your beautiful country and your wonderful city, Tbilisi, that we are all in love with. This event is organized to celebrate the 30th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the United States and Georgia. So we're very glad to be here. I, being an itinerant person here, do not have a printer at my disposal. So I will be reading the bios of our wonderful authors here from my cell phone. What we'll do is I'll read their bios, then they will do a short reading for you, and then we'll launch into conversation, and then I'll open up the floor to questions. Christopher Merrill is an American poet, essayist, journalist, and translator. He has published 6 collections of poetry, including Watch Fire, for which he received the Peter I.B. Lavan Younger Poets Award. He has published numerous translations, edited several volumes, and many more books of nonfiction, 2 of them devoted to Walt Whitman. His critically acclaimed Only the Nails Remain, seen from the Balkan Wars, chronicles his 10-year wartime journeys to the Balkans from the years 1992 through 1996. Currently, he serves as the director of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. Christopher, would you like to read now, or would you like would you like me to read all your bios first before we launch into reading?
I'll be happy to talk about covering the war in the former Yugoslavia during the discussion, but I was thinking, as the professor was speaking, how important it is to preserve those ancient texts from the 7th century, because in Sarajevo during the war, of course, Serbian shells destroyed the National Library and the Oriental Institute, and countless books and texts and illuminated manuscripts were destroyed. A complete legacy wiped out. But I'm going to read something much newer. This is from my most recent book of prose poems titled Flares, and I'm reading, at the request of the professor in the audience, a prose poem titled Oligarchy. They brought sand from the Gobi Desert, gold from Tashkent, and oil from a tanker listing in the Black Sea, offerings laid on a long table draped with banners of white and red in a house at the water's edge. They had suspended their studies in hydrology. They told their host, frustrated in their attempts to draw borders for the expanding floodplain, their decisions to track him down as his summer place was as inexplicable to him as their determination to walk the length of the Silk Road and the pleasure they seemed to take in detailing their failed experiments. Their inability to describe the motions of an eel forever swimming upstream in their aquarium left him mystified. What did they hope to gain for all their trouble? Unlimited funding for their lab and access to the agenda of the next legislative session. The host ordered them to restrict their movements to his property in daylight hours. If you get too near the pot, he said, you'll get dirty. They wrapped themselves in silks spun in Samarkand, lit a lamp stolen from a flat in Bukhara, sprinkled salt from a cotton field irrigated by the shrinking Aral Sea. The host recalled a childhood outing to a dacha built on the slope above the uranium mine, closed after the revolution. How the oligarch let the orphans swim in the pool. How the sky glowed at dusk. How happy they were. Thank you.
Rozá Alcala was born in Paterson, New Jersey, to Spanish immigrants. She's a poet and translator who has given many readings, talks, and workshops in both the United States and Latin America. Roza's poems appear in numerous anthologies and journals, and her most recent book of poetry, My Other Tongue, was described in the New York Times as capturing, quote, the messy emotions and miscommunications that move between languages, end quote. Recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Translation Fellowship and a runner-up for the PEN Translation Award, Rozá is a professor of creative writing at the University of Texas at El Paso, where she teaches in its bilingual MFA program. Welcome, Rozá.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. So I was going to read something from my book, but I was asked to read this poem that's from a new manuscript, and the book hasn't been published yet, but it was published in the Georgia Review, which is a literary journal in the US, and so I'm going to read it. It's called Are You Okay? August 3rd, 2019, and on August 3rd, 2019, a man drove for several hours from one part of Texas down to El Paso, Texas, where I live. And he entered a Walmart there at a time when, you know, on August 3rd, many people were shopping for school supplies for the new school year. And it was also a Walmart. El Paso has a very large Mexican-American, Latino population, but Mexican citizens cross the border to go shopping in El Paso all the time. So there were many people shopping there that this killer wanted to target. He was hunting Hispanics, and he drove several hours to kill 23 people and injure many more. And I was writing a book in the second person during this time, and every text I was getting was in the second person asking me if I was okay, because they had heard the news and they didn't know what was going on. They didn't know if it happened at a shopping mall close to Walmart or if it was at the Walmart. So it was a moment of what's happening, what's happening, what's happening. Are you okay? August 3rd, 2019. Checking in. Let me know you're not anywhere near Cielo Vista Mall, please. Active shooter in the area. Just heard about the shooting in El Paso. You guys all okay? I just read there was a shooting in an El Paso mall, assuming you're all fine, but just checking. Si usted y su familia están en El Paso, espero que estén a salvo, safe and sound. Are you guys okay? You guys okay? Thinking of you and El Paso and our American addiction to gun violence. ¿Cómo están? Qué tragedia horrible. Les mando muchos besos, querida. Are you all okay? Sending heart emoji and cariño. Just reading about El Paso, sending all my heart emoji. Colleagues, I hope you and yours are all safe. Heart emoji. Just want to tell everyone I know that I love them. XXOO. I hope you and your family are safe. My dear, I'm sorry to text you to ask if you are all safe and sound, but I love you and I must. This is horrific. Please tell me you were nowhere near Walmart today. Praying hands emoji. Hey fam, thinking of you. Breaking heart emoji for El Chuco. Are you okay? How are you doing, hermana? I miss you. Terribly upsetting situation in El Paso. My heart goes out to you all. ¿Cómo están ustedes? ¿Estás bien y tu familia y conocidos? Crying emoji. Muy doloroso. No paro de llorar.
Thank you, Rozá. And that piece is a visual delight. I encourage everybody to later Google Georgia Review and Are You Okay? It's a stunning piece. Next we have Angie Cruz, who is a New York-born Dominicana who traveled to and from New York City and the Dominican Republic for most of her formative years. Her novel, Dominicana, was the inaugural book pick for the Good Morning America Book Club and chosen as the 2019-2020 Word Up Uptown Reads. Her fourth novel, How Not to Drown in a Glass of Water, is forthcoming soon in this fall of 2020. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of the award-winning literary journal ***, and is currently a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. She divides her time between Pittsburgh, New York, and Turin. Fancy you.
Hi, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for coming. And Rozá, that was very, very powerful and emotional. I'm letting that sit a little in my heart. We're going through a lot in the United States, as you all are watching on the news. Okay, so my novel Dominicana is set in 1965. It's about a 15-year-old who is married to a man who is twice her age against her will because her parents wanted her and the entire family to have a better life. And at this point of the book, Juan, the character who wants to marry Ana, who is 15, had promised to return, but he didn't actually return. He made a proposal and then he didn't come back. And the mother is very stressed that this deal might not go through. So, when Juan doesn't visit for a long while, Mama makes me write him letters. Tell him how hot it's been, unbearable, how long you see the snow, how you long to see the snow, how handsome he looks in a suit, and that your favorite color is green to remind him about your eyes. They're unusual. Maybe it'll inspire him to bring you a gift. Tell him how well you're doing in school, how you love numbers so much you dream of them while you sleep. In this way, Juan and I are the same. I too count the steps to school, how many times the teacher repeats herself, even the impossible things I count, like the stars in the sky, the limoncillos on our tree. Tell him how much you enjoy to cook. Be specific. Don't just say food, say pescado con coco, so he knows you're the kind of woman who's not afraid to debone a fish or grate a coconut. What kind of woman is afraid to grate coconuts? I ask, but Mama keeps talking. Invite him to visit during the day so you can cook him a proper meal at a proper time. Say how much you would enjoy feeding him, that you miss him and would like to see him again. But that's not true, I say. Oh, who cares what's true? Look, what is the truth? Letters are a lasso, words on a page that we fling out, hoping and hoping. What about what I want? What do you want, Ana? I don't know. If Teresa, your sister, was a duck, she would have saved herself from that man, El Guardia, Mama says. Now she's stuck with bad seed. Her life is basically ruined. Ruined. Ducks reject unwanted sperm, only allowing in the sperm they want. They choose the best duck to make their babies, not just any grubby, ugly-looking duck. And they sleep with one eye open, unless they have some other duck on guard. Learn from the ducks, Mama says. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. Dominicana is an excellent novel, and it's also an excellent audiobook, should you be interested in that. Ayanna Mathis's first novel, The 12 Tribes of Hattie, was a New York Times bestseller, and the second selection for Oprah's Book Club 2.0. The book tells the story of the children of the Great Migration, which is the largest movement of people in United States history, as approximately 6 million Black people moved from the American South to northern, Midwestern, and Western states throughout the 20th century to escape racism and pursue the American dream. Ayanna currently hosts and curates the Black Arts Dialogue series, a conversation series centered around art and Blackness, and hosted by the African American and African Diasporic Studies Department at Columbia University. Welcome, Ayanna.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to the rector for coming and taking time out of what is no doubt a very busy day, to the university for hosting us, to the embassy, of course, and to all of you for coming here today. I'm also going to read just very briefly about a page or so. Niloufer's description of the book was pretty much all you need to know and quite thorough. I'm going to read from the very beginning, The first chapter is the one in which Hattie and her husband August have just come up from Georgia, and they get married very quickly, and they have children. They have twins, and these are her firstborns. She is 17 years old in this chapter, and I should say it's set in 1923. So she's trying to care for these twins who have pneumonia. But of course, in 1923, having pneumonia is a pretty bad thing. So they're very, very, very sick, and she's sort of trying to care for them, and she's thinking various things. Their names, are Philadelphia and Jubilee. Hattie's babies burned brightly. Their fevers spiked, their legs wheeled, their cheeks went red as suns. Hattie took the bottle of Ipecac from the medicine cabinet and dosed them. They coughed too hard to swallow. The medicine dribbled from the sides of their mouths. Hattie wiped her children's faces and gave them more Ipecac and massaged their heaving chests. Her hands moved expertly from task to task. Her hands were quick and capable, even as Hattie wept and pleaded. How her babies burned, how they wanted to live. Hattie had thought, when given over to such thoughts, that her children's souls were thimbles of fog, wispy and ungraspable. She was just a girl, only 17 years older than her children. Hattie understood them as extensions of herself, and she loved them because they were hers, and because they were defenseless, and because they needed her. But she looked at her babies now and saw that the life inside them was muscled and mighty and would not be driven from them. Fight, Hattie urged. Like this, she said, and blew the air in and out of her own lungs in solidarity with them to show them it was possible. Like this, she said again. She sat cross-legged on the floor with Jubilee balanced in the crook of one knee and Philadelphia in the other. She patted their backs to bring the phlegm up and out. Hattie remembered what she had learned when she was still a girl back in Georgia, before she had come to Philadelphia, this place so full of hope. In Georgia, the preacher had called the North a new Jerusalem. The congregation said he was a traitor to the cause of the Southern Negro. He was gone the next day on a train to Chicago. Others too were going, disappearing from their shops or the fields, from their streets, their seats on the church pew, occupied at Sunday service, but empty by Wednesday prayer meeting. All of those souls escaped from the South were at this very moment glowing with promise in the wretched winters of the cities of the North. Hattie knew her babies would survive, though they were small and struggling. Philadelphia and Jubilee were already among those luminous souls, already the beginning of a new nation.
Thank you, Ayanna. Questions that I wanted to start with in an order here, but since Ayanna just read, did you skip the very first page? Did you go in? Yes, I thought so. I was hoping that you would read the very first page. Would you mind indulging me in reading the very first paragraph of your book? Because it leads to the question that I have for all of our authors here.
Philadelphia and Jubilee, August said when Hattie told him what she wanted to name their twins. You can't give them babies no crazy names like that.
Thank you. And that is the beginning of, that's the first line of the novel, first two lines of the novel, right? So this leads to the question I want to ask of all of our authors here, which is the question of voice and tone and finding your voice and finding your voice as an author, as a writer, but also finding the voice and point of view of your characters, which is not an easy thing to do. Those are two completely different things. And so all of you have very unique voices. Just heard Ayanna, we've just heard Ana from Dominicana, we've just heard the beautiful and stunning and heartbreaking prose poem from Rosá, and also Christopher's voice is extremely lyrical even when he's writing prose. As was indicated, you didn't read from it today, but from your memoir, which is Self-Portrait with Dogwood. It's an incredibly beautifully poetic text. So why don't you all tell us about how you found your voice as an author, and also if you wanted to talk about how you found the voice and the specific tones of the characters in the works that you've read. Or in the case of poetry, it would be just, the narration, the work itself.
Well, it seems to me that every book I write is completely different from what I wrote before, and it's a long process of discovery how to write that book. And I'll tell you something about how I wrote the book about the war by saying that I traveled for months and months in the early days of the Balkan Wars, took countless notes everywhere I went, and after about 7, 8, 9 months, found myself in a basement in Sarajevo under shell fire. And for about 24 hours, the house that I was staying in was being shelled from one side or another. It was absolutely terrifying. And what I did was, everyone had a different way of dealing with their terror. One man was telling lots of jokes. There were humanitarians in this basement, and Bosnian Serbs and Croats. I found myself writing down what everybody said. So I thought, if nothing else, at the end of the day, I'll have a record of what happened in this basement should we all survive. And the kinds of stories that took place in that setting. There was a Bosnian tennis professional who was now working as a guard. And he told me, and he was chain smoking, which is what you do in a war zone. And he told me that when the war came to an end, he would teach tennis for 55 minutes and then smoke for 5 minutes before he gave the next lesson. And I said to him, I don't think that's very healthy. And he said, do you think the shells coming down around us are healthy? So I was getting those kinds of stories down. Then it turned out that I drank some bad water while I was there. I didn't know this until I ended up, I hurt my back. I took a humanitarian flight to Split, Croatia. I lay in bed with a kind of war dysentery for 3 days, feverish. And then at around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd or 4th day, the fever broke. And I heard this song that I'd heard once before in a bombed-out hotel in Dubrovnik, Croatia. And I thought, wow, that music is so beautiful, so hauntingly familiar. And in a flash, I thought, I could write a chapter, just one day of life in the basement of 12 people, how they survive a day. And that will come to stand for all the days in which Sarajevans would endure such atrocities day after day after day. Of course, I had 2 or 3 more years of traveling to complete the research for that book, but I started to see how to put that book together. So there was a long period of uncertainty and terror and research, and in a flash I could see how to write that book, and that solved that problem. And then all the books that follow present new problems that you hope and pray you will find solutions for them.
Thank you.
Thank you. I actually thought about voice a lot for this book, because this book is about this idea of the mother tongue. What is the mother tongue? If you're the child of immigrants and your parents speak a different language at home, but you speak another language at school or at work, then your mother tongue may be different from the one that you feel most comfortable speaking in, but yet we use the mother tongue to mean the language that we've mastered. So voice is connected to, obviously to language, because we use it to articulate things, but I often, and some of you may be familiar with this, but when you speak more than one language, your voice may sound different in one language or another, right? So I think I'm a little, more high-pitched in Spanish and lower-pitched in English. There's just a way in which my voice changes. And maybe adapts to cultural norms or does different things because the language does different things. But in poetry itself, in American contemporary poetry, there's been, for a long time been a discussion around voice. Like, what is voice? Is voice something that we all have as writers inside of us that we're looking for? And the poet Ron Padgett used to joke, there used to be a newspaper in New York called The Village Voice. And he'd say, when he'd hear people say, I'm looking for my voice, he'd be like, what do you mean? You're looking for your copy of your Village Voice? Like, where is my voice? Where is my voice? And I thought, well, I wanted to explore that question in the book. Like, what is a voice? And as a writer, what are you looking for? And I begin one poem with, I believe in voice like I believe in ghosts. Because I think that it's not just the voice that we possess that we're putting on the page, but we're channeling other voices onto the page. And some of those voices are, voices of ancestors. Some of those voices are those who have been silenced within our families or in larger society. So you are, for me, it's this thing that haunts me. And sometimes it is my own voice, and I don't know that it's my voice until it's on the page. And then I'm trying to say something, and sometimes it's someone else's voice speaking through me. And I think that's all I'll say about that.
Thank you, Rosa. Absolutely, if you would like. Well, I don't know if you still have it on your cell phone, but the first sentence of your Dominicana is an arresting one.
Let's see. I do have it.
Sets everything up.
Yes.
I remember when I was reading, when I picked up Dominicana and I read the first sentence, I was like, oh God, I have to cancel everything for the next week.
The first sentence is, the first time Juan Reese proposes, I'm 11 years old, skinny and flat-chested. It's interesting. Everything you've all said is something that resonates with me a lot, and I'm thinking, what can I add to that? And I guess, every book is a different process in thinking about voice, because, like you said, it's like we're taught looking for voice, and then you're like, where is it? And you keep finding new ones. But with Dominicana, because it was inspired by my mother's story, a lot of it was about what she didn't say. And I wrote the book in many different variations. Are there any writers here? Anyone that writes stories or poems? I'm just curious, are you really shy and not saying that you write stories? Because Dato, a writer we met, said that almost everyone in Georgia is a writer. But anyway, so with this particular book, I was trying to create a young person that I imagined my mother being before this experience that happened to her. And I imagined that voice to be very different. And it came to me in a dream. I woke up with that line, actually. And after many years of trying to figure out how to write the story, I woke up one day and she said exactly that line. And I just said, okay, this is the beginning of the novel. With my new book, it happened really differently. I was on a very crowded platform in New York City, about to take the train, and it was an awful day. It was hot, it smelled bad, and everyone was yelling and upset, and I saw this woman sitting in the corner very quietly studying English. And she was older, and she reminded me of a lot of the women in my family who lost their jobs during the Great Recession in 2008. And as if it was someone who was trying to start again her life. And immediately this character came to me. Her name is Cara Romero, and she just started to speak to me and tell me her story. She goes, you want to know something about me? Let me tell you about my life. And she started to speak, and I decided that I would immediately start writing what she was telling me, as if I was possessed with this voice. And I did it all on my phone. I wrote a lot of it on my phone. And I decided that she would only come to me. I decided, me and her, she will only speak to me, otherwise I would go crazy, when I was on a train, a plane, or a bus. I'll end there.
Nice, very nice.
Yeah, it's a hard question, and it's a hard one to add to because everyone said such incredible things. But I guess on the topic of voice in general, sometimes all of us teach writing, And sometimes students will say, well, the same thing. Where do I find my voice? It's under a chair. Is it at the grocery store? Is it hiding in the closet? Whatever. I don't know. I still don't know what it is, and I don't know how to define it. But the longer I sort of think about it and write, the more I think that it is actually not about style or things on the page at all, but rather about your obsessions. And the questions that you're asking about the world, and the questions you're asking about your own experience, and that in that way, because those things recur, and they sort of, very often writers will kind of write variations of the same sorts of obsessive questioning throughout their lives in different ways, and what happens on the page stylistically and things like that seems to arise out of your obsessions in a certain way. So sometimes I wonder if voice is just obsessions. For this book, these characters, it was very important to me. How they speak was very important to me. All the characters in this book are Black. All the characters probably in every book I ever write will probably be Black. And these are poor people who have very particular economies and social hierarchies. And some of their social hierarchies are about skin color, being lighter, being darker, what neighborhood you live in, things like that, because they don't have any money. And very importantly also, some of their hierarchies are about the way that you speak. So the first character who, when Nulafar asked me to read that sentence, they both come from the South, but his voice is deeply Southern inflected, and his accent is. And Hattie, the title character, on the other hand, is not. And they're also from different classes. So it was very important the way various people speak, not just in this novel, but also the one that I'm working on now, because they're markers of class, they're markers of the ways in which other people will perceive them, the ways that they perceive themselves. And I think very often with Black characters, there are sort of stereotypes about how Black people speak this way or speak that way or whatever, which of course are not true, but often the nuances of the ways that speech and inflection and diction matter inside of individual communities is overlooked. So that was something that I was really interested in and concerned with representing.
Thank you. So I have a question from you all that I've been dying to ask you all, and that is, since a lot of us here, myself, Ayanna, Rozá, Enji, are generally othered, I'm hoping that the interpreter is not going to kill me, othered, thank you, in our own countries, in our own cultures, we are somehow expected to speak for, define, defend, and write about our otherness and our identities. And I find this somehow problematic because people who are generally of the European American descent don't really have to do that. And so it sets up a particular current of literature, a particular line of dialogue and rhetoric and narratives that sort of carries history in that way for people who are othered. In my own mind, of course, I can't speak for you and you will speak for yourselves, but in my own mind, I am not an other person. In my own mind, I'm not a woman, I'm not a person of Iranian descent, I'm not a hyphenated American. In my own mind, I'm not any of that. But it seems to me that the publishing industry feeds the appetite of readers to expect these kinds of narratives from people like us. So I was wondering whether you've given this any thought, whether you have any opinions about it or any visceral reactions to it. And of course, Kριστoffer, since you're exactly on the other side of the coin of that, I'd love to hear from you as well in the end in terms of how you, leading an international writing program, deal with that as a cultural ambassador.
It's a complicated question. I mean, I told a story the other day about an American writer who people may or may not know named Toni Morrison. And she's inarguably one of the most important American writers of the last century, sort of up till now, so this century and the 20th, I think. She's a Nobel laureate, etc. And I was at some bookstore somewhere. This was a few years ago, many years ago, actually. And I was looking for a novel of hers. And the bookstore had like an American literature section, and then it had an African American literature section. And Toni Morrison, who is a Nobel laureate, a Pulitzer Prize winner, who is one of the most important literary voices that the United States has produced in 100 years at least, was in the African American section. This bothered me very much for many reasons. And one of the reasons, because it felt like she had been taken out of the current of American literature and put somewhere else. But it also bothered me because her characters, very famously, she has talked about, are black characters. That she says, black humanity is humanity. That's who I write about. She said, these sorts of things are in the center of the universe. These are my center. And so, for her to be, because of that, it's as though stories about Black Americans don't get to be, like, we don't get to be Americans, we get to be African Americans. So that's one side of it that is enraging, and is certainly a symptom of sort of all of the things that Nulafar was referencing. The other side, however, is that these stories have been absolutely underrepresented. They are underrepresented. They continue to be underrepresented in the publishing industry. So, it's a really complicated question, I think. And I think also, with regard to representation specifically, what I tell students very often is that they are allowed to write about whatever it is that they want to write about. And I think very often that I answer the question that way because any number of people, of Latinx people, of African American people, of all sorts of people in freedom movements for many years have done a lot of sacrificing and sometimes a lot of dying so that I can write my book. And they would not want me to feel that I had to do some sort of specific thing. They died so that I could be, if ever such a thing is possible, which I have my doubts about, but their goal was that people could be, their children, their grandchildren could be free. And that also means artistic freedom. And so I think a lot about honoring that, and I encourage my students to honor that. If you want to write about whatever it is you want to write about, you write about it.
Ayanna, I hear that, and I hear that about American literature and African American literature being two different categories. I worked at bookstores for my entire college years and a few years beyond that, and I got fired from one of my jobs because I refused to categorize literature, the literature section, between literature and women's literature. So, and this was a long time ago, this was in the 1990s. But, to what you were saying, you tell your students that they should write about whatever they want to write about, but there is such a thing as critical thinking and social awareness, cultural awareness, in that I think if we're not teaching them to think about these narratives and the perpetuations of certain curated narratives, then they will continue to write and feed the publishing agendas and the marketing buzzwords that have been fed to us. So I think it's really important to sort of resist that and sort of have counter narratives to that as well, so that we're not always niched into just one specific spot. Angie, Rosa?
I think on the other side of that too is I have students who don't think that the story they have to tell or the experience of their families is worthy subject matter for literature, right? So they, even if they, are Latinx or women or queer, They don't think their particular experience matters. And I often get students, and I think perhaps more undergraduates, who want to write something universal. And I tell them, no, your experience is worthy subject matter and you should write about it, and that you should write about it in any way. Like, I don't even think they're aware of all of the different aesthetic debates that happened in the 20th century, or all the infighting in the world of poetry of like what a poem should look or sound like. But I think that maybe at some point when they are aware, they think that the kind of thing that they are supposed to write should be written in a particular way. Like it shouldn't be experimental, it should be narrative, it should be accessible, right? I mean, I come from a working class background, and I've been asked that, early on, not as much recently, because I think actually my work has become more accessible, but when I was writing very experimental work, well, how do you feel about, people who you grew up with not being able to read your poems, as if this was my responsibilities to make sure that everything I, wrote could be read by someone from my neighborhood. So that responsibility was there. And I think that if you look at the diversity of Latinx writers aesthetically, I mean, ** is a great example of this. You heard in the introduction, Angie Cruz publishes this wonderful magazine called **. The diversity, literary journals aren't always diverse aesthetically, but the diversity in aesthetics that would just show you, right, that Latinx writers are, writing very experimental work, and they're also publishing things that maybe one would consider less experimental, even though I have, I don't know if I always agree with those categories, and I find them problematic. But I think it's also of not being tied to a particular school, right? Not thinking that one has to write a particular way.
That's amazing. It sounds like you have also the pressure from the other side as well, not just the pressure from sort of what gets published and what gets sold, but also pressure that you should please and appease your own community, so to speak, That's double pressure there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as a younger writer, it's changed a lot. Like, I think about the shelves. I mean, it used to be very true that when you went to a bookstore, there would be the women's literature section, the African American section, the Chicana section, and the American literature section. And I, as a young person that I didn't read books by African American writers until I went to the university. So for me, I would just go to that section and buy everything. And I was so happy that section existed because it made it easy for me to find the books that I was looking for. Now we have algorithms, and you go online and they'll just have a list, and you don't have to go through every book that's published in a year to find a book that's specific to your interest. Is it climate? Is it women's literature, etc.? But I always thought, why not both? Why not have Toni Morrison in the American section and also have the algorithm so we can find books that we're interested in? Is it, coming of age stories, grief, loss, like all these stories, like when you have the algorithm, then you're like, these are the books I'm looking for, literatures that help me through this passage. And they should also be in the categories of literature. So I think there should be both and I think that's what's hopefully happening now, that technology has made it really easy to create these algorithms, although we're still being categorized by publishers. I feel like writers of color, even though there's a lot of possibility to, for example, have a book like mine be more than an immigration book, it's rarely categorized as something more than an immigration book. It's actually an American story, right? But unfortunately, that takes a kind of education to see that I am also an American and I offer an American story. However, when I think about the othered as a writer, like you said, my mother fought so much in her life so I can be free as possible, within the constraints of patriarchy and sexism and racism and everything that exists. The least I could do when I am doing my work is try to figure out how I can freely express myself. So I try to disconnect from whatever anyone expects or wants, I mean, because no matter what, you'll fail. The truth is, I continuously fail people's expectations. My mother's, my brother's, my lovers, everybody. So I might as well be free to do whatever I want. Brava.
I just want to
Total
say,
freedom.
Angie has never failed my expectations.
Christopher.
I guess the way I'll just answer this is to say that the International Writing Program brings together distinguished writers from all around the world, and the virtue of giving poets and fiction writers and essayists and playwrights and filmmakers a space to do their work and to be in conversation with writers from all around the world is that it expands their sense of possibility as writers. So if, for example, we have, as we do every year, an Israeli writer in residence with a Palestinian writer, that's instructive not only for the two writers, but for all the writers around them. They will never agree on political issues, but they will find common ground on various other matters. So that's what we do at the International Writing Program. And when I have the good luck to bring writers out into the world on these Lines and Spaces tours, I feel an obligation to be as representative of the American literary experience as I can. But I should say that how we put together this delegation of writers is that I reached out to Angie, who had traveled with us on a couple of other occasions, and I said, we have this chance to go to Georgia, and to Tbilisi, and would you be interested? And of course, Angie immediately said yes. And you know, my next door neighbor is Ayanna Mathis, who I knew from her days as a student at the Writers' Workshop. And when I asked Ayanna if she wanted to come, yes. And so you can see it's starting to come together, but it's a sort of a fluid experience. And then a little bit later, we had another poet who was going to come, but his wife had twins, so that was that. And there were complications with the pregnancy, so, but we were still looking for one more writer, and Angie said, well, we need another poet, how about Rozа? And so when I saw that, I thought, okay, this works. This gives a picture that I hope is somewhat representative of the genuine diversity of American literary experience. Everything that my colleagues have said on this panel, I agree with, and the only thing I would add to that is that it's really a pleasure to travel with people who have a great sense of humor, as they do.
I'm going to add one more thing. One, it's come up a number of times, so I wanted to bring it up because it's connected to this. With some of the writers we've met, that some feel very strongly, I am a woman writer, and others that feel like, I am just a writer, I don't want to be seen as a woman writer, which I think is something also that when we're talking about othering, we feel strongly like, I just want you to see me as a writer, a great writer, a brilliant writer, a genius writer, not a woman writer. What does that mean when you say that? However, I do think at the beginning of any movement of emancipation or being taken seriously, to say you're a woman, African American, Latina, whatever it is that you decide to say, is also saying, I want to show you the complexity and the breadth of my voice, which is beyond anything you've ever seen. It's innovation, it's exciting. So I do think that, again, like, it's sometimes we feel like, oh, we're making ourselves small, but actually what we're saying is, I want to expand your definition of whatever it is. When I say woman, what do you think when you see me? Let me give you a lot more to see. And I think that could be really exciting, especially in the beginning of movements where that is a new way to look at literature.
Well, I think if I could add one thing too, I think just in what Angie said, I think it's absolutely the case, and I think the problem is other, to use that word, right? Because the problem is a larger problem, which I guess is sort of self-evident, but I may as well just say it, right? The problem is a larger problem of of racism and sexism and xenophobia, right? Because these are and situations, not and/or situations. You're not Black or American or a woman or a writer, right? Like you, and so the reason that these distinctions become necessary and this sort of necessity to sort of show the breadth of what you are is because it had been assumed that that was not there. And that's where this stuff comes from. And I think the last thing I would say about it also is that, sometimes I wonder, like, she's referencing a class that we did earlier today, and when there was a woman there who was like, I'm not I just want to be a writer, I just want to be a great writer. And I think that sometimes, and here we go back to the sexism and the racism and the xenophobia, that woman on some level, and I certainly can't speak for her, but perhaps there is also some fear that if you're a woman writer, then you don't get to be a real writer, right? You don't get to tell universal stories. You don't get to be taken seriously. People, instead of asking you about your craft and your artistry, are only going to ask you about Roe v. Wade, which is a thing that happens to women writers and to artists of color in general. So I think it's just a very complicated question.
Yes, it is, and you all spoke so beautifully about it on both sides of the coin. Thank you very much. Well, certainly all of the work that you all do is considered cultural translation, which is something I've sort of come up with. It goes beyond translation, literary translation, literal translation of translating one author from one language into another language, but there's also certainly translating stories of other cultures and other experiences into forms that are accessible to people that are not those people, so to others. So for example, your work is, I would consider that cultural translation. Ayanna, Angie, I would consider your work cultural translation. We have two poets here who are also literary translators who translate poets from other languages into English. Kριστoffer translates from several languages, including Korean and Slovenian, is that right? Am I missing any languages? Korean and Slovenian, into English. I imagine that you're using intermediaries or working with the authors themselves, yes? And Rozá, you translate from Spanish into English. You've translated notably Cecilia Vicuña, who is a Chilean poet and feminist and eco-activist and wonderful performance poet, who's New York-based. Is that right?
Yeah, she has a big show at the Kurdistan. She's a visual artist.
Yes, she's quite stunning. And you've translated her work in at least 2 books. Is that right?
Yes.
Or 1 book, 2 books. That was the one that was a finalist for the PEN Translation Prize. Is that right?
That's another one that's about her performances.
Okay.
So it's a collection of her performances plus sort of oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Yes, I've published more than 1 book of translations of her poems, but there's 1 book called Spit Temple, The Selected Performances, and her performances are improvised. So, through the years, I've come to understand that her ethos is wrapped up in how her performances are created, in the sense of making herself vulnerable and being in the space of creating something that can fall apart or not work or have to sort of be built on site, right? So these improvised pieces. And so I started working, part of my dissertation was on it, and then it became a book, working on collecting these performances and transcribing them, and then giving it some critical framework, and having other people write some pieces on it. And then this book came a few years after, and it's called The New and Selected Poems of Cecilia Vicuña, and these are poems from the 60s when she was in Chile through to, I think it's 2015 is the last poem, and there's some other translators in this anthology as well.
How did you come to translation, Rozá?
Willingly. No, it's not true, actually not willingly. I didn't want to translate when I was in an MFA program. I took a translation class because so many people told me, because I was bilingual, you should be a translator, you should translate. Professors would say you should translate. But I had translated my entire life. You know, this is true of you know, most children of immigrants. You're in the doctor's office, you're with the lawyer, you're in the emergency room, and you're only 9 years old, and you are hoping, and especially in the emergency room, that you are translating what the doctor said correctly. So I was kind of done with it. I wanted to lead my own life, and I don't think I articulated it then, but there was a resistance to it. And I translated some of El Diván del Tabarit by Lorca, which is a text that most people don't read in English. And I was like, I think I'm good at this. And then Cecilia Vicuña, a friend of mine went to a Cecilia Vicuña performance. She was reading with Allen Ginsberg at the Poetry Project in New York, and he came back with the book, this Unraveling Words and the Weaving of Water. It was the first book that she published in English. And I was blown away by the poems, but I was also blown away by the work of the translators. It was Elliot Weinberg and Suzanne Jill Levine, who are amazing translators. And our friendship began. I wrote to her. This was, you know what, it was right when email, you know, sort of the beginnings of email, but I wrote her a letter. And she wrote back to me and said, you know, many people write me letters, but I wrote back to you because your name is Rozá Alcalá. She said that name, it, you know, compelled me to write back to you. So she wrote back to me, and I brought her to Brown to read. And then we happened to be in Scotland at the same time. I went to Edinburgh. She had a show in Edinburgh. And as these things happen, as you know, as a translator, this happens often. It's like, you know, we should put together a little book for this exhibition. Let's put together some poems. Can you translate them? You know, my boyfriend at the time had a small press, so he was going to publish this little book for, and so it was very improvised, but that was the 90s, and we've been working. I mean, not, you know, we don't work consistently, you know, on every project together, but I've been translating her since 1997.
So we're going to hear from Kριστoffer, but if you could find a short and lovely translation, perhaps you could read that. But while Kριστoffer is addressing how he got to translation and how he came to it.
Well, I came to it in a couple of different ways. In graduate school, I had to do a year of Old English, which entailed in the last the last term was to translate Beowulf, 100 lines a day. So, and I found that I absolutely loved doing that, and so that got me thinking about translation. But then what happened is I was reading some translations of André Breton, the great French surrealist, and I was reading the translations that, in my view, were so wooden, and they were just dead. And I thought, oh, I can do better than that. And so I translated a poem by Breton, and for about an hour, I felt like I was a genius. And then I realized, of course, that it was Breton who was the genius, but I loved being inside his skin for the duration of the translation. And so I've gone on to translate lots of other poets, as Niloufar said, sometimes in working with a native speaker. I don't speak Korean, but I work with, I think we've done 10 or 11 books now, Won Chung Kim and I, and right now we're doing a book, we've done 2 books, maybe 3 books, where of classical Korean books of poetry and novels, where they're written originally in Chinese characters. So Won Chung had to ask a colleague to translate from the Chinese characters into Korean, and then he translates that into English, a rudimentary translation, and then I try to make some kind of a poem in English, and then we go back and forth, and I ask him lots of questions, and it's a completely indefensible way to translate, except that how many American poets can read the ancient Chinese characters that Korean poets used and bring it into English. So for me, it's a great way to renew my sense of what literature can be.
Yes, discontent is the great motivator for translations to be born. Rosa, you have something for us?
Yes, I'm gonna read a poem from 1971. This was before she went to London on a painting scholarship. And so she was still in Chile, and she was writing all these wild poems. And this is from a book called Sabor a mí. And it's called New Erotic Designs for Furniture. And the original book has little illustrations, but this does not. New Erotic Designs for Furniture. Dreaming of a vast world, we have come to the definite conclusion that physical positions in a civilized world are too constricting. Therefore, we would eliminate the position sitting in a chair and suggest instead a different kind of furniture that allows for multiplicity of movements and physical situations in line with each body's specific wiring. This idea will be of special interest to those who obsessively or by obligation remain immobile for long hours, e.g. students, office workers, machine operators, meeting attendees. Models will be built for those who hate to write while sitting, allowing them to kneel, lie on their bellies, squat, or hang upside down. This furniture will promote the health and beauty of all its users, thanks to the peculiar increase in blood circulation and inevitable protuberance of thighs and asses, which are undoubtedly part of my plan.
Thank you. We're coming to a time when I'll open up the floor for some questions, but just one last question, if you could briefly address. Would you be comfortable in sharing what you are working on now? Briefly? Well, I know Angie has a book coming up, but have you already started working on something new, or?
What I'm working on right now, actually, the book I'm working on this summer, after Tbilisi, I'm going to Turin. Is that on? Oh, thank you. I am going to Turin, Italy, after Tbilisi, to finish a book that I started many years ago about the life of an immigrant in Turin. When I was there before the pandemic, I had interviewed a lot of workers, Italian workers, who told me they hadn't gotten paid in a really long time, and they had very strong sentiments against new immigrant populations. And I found it really interesting how candidly they would talk to me, because I was American. And I obviously, as an immigrant in the United States, or as a daughter of an immigrant of the United States, felt this weird position where I had access to both sides of the story. So that's my new novel, my novel that I'm working on right now.
Ayanna?
So I won't say much because, I literally just handed in a novel 2 weeks ago, I guess, something like this, that I have been working on for about 8 years. And so yeah, it's a novel and it's new, and I just handed it in.
Congratulations. You need a massage. Christopher?
Well, I'm always hoping to write poems. I'm doing these translations, and I'm late in turning in a biography of an important early American colonial figure, Roger Williams, who gave Americans the idea of the separation of church and state, and that fundamental truth about the liberty of conscience, freedom of thought, which, of course, at the moment is under attack in my country. So that's why my editor is really on my back about turning this book in as soon as possible.
Rozá?
I mentioned it briefly when I read that poem that's in the second person. A friend of mine, Carmen Jimenez, who's a well-known poet in the US, we would tell each other stories about when we were younger. Just like, oh, I did this crazy thing when I did this crazy thing. And she said, you should turn those into poems. They should turn those into persona poems. And I said, I'm not going to write these poems. But I started just as an exercise writing about them, and I realized that these vignettes, these little stories that first sort of began in my 20s, so the first poems take place in my 20s, kind of revealed a pattern of the ways that we're indoctrinated into ideas around misogyny and sexism. And so I went back further and started to write more poems beginning at the age of 12. So I don't want to say that this is autobiographical, because I like more freedom than that, but it's sort of a memoir in prose poems in the second person, in which an older self speaks to a younger self.
Thank you, Rosa, and thank you all for all your thoughts, and we'll open up the floor to for some questions to you.
Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Nilüfer, very much for taking this job to host and moderate these talks. It was very interesting to me as a Georgian literary scholar to hear your ideas about identity, diversity, double discourse, double identities, and double ethnic backgrounds for American writers. And there is one more thing I would appreciate hearing from you. It's how you, as an American writer, appreciate the work of literary critics in the United States. What do you expect from them? How's your expectations? And what do would like to hear from them? This question is derived from our Georgian experience also, because in Georgia, because of this totalitarian and Soviet experience, literary criticism was a very biased and very ideologized branch of literature. And in many cases, the literary critics could bring a big damage to writers if they were biased or if they were negative about their work. So in totalitarian time, this can cost a life of a writer, and in a more mild post-Stalin period, it would just be very unpleasant for the author to hear some negative assessment of on behalf of the critic. Today, Georgian writers, more contemporary Georgian writers, complain that they don't receive enough feedback from Georgian literary critics, and maybe somewhat deeply in their heart, they still want to hear something positive about their works, and they're quite vulnerable when they hear some negative assessment, even some harsh criticism, or some, of course, they appreciate positive things to be heard. So I will be very grateful if you could speak frankly about your expectations from literary critics.
I guess there's two. So there's the sophisticated intellectual answer, and then there's the writer answer, right? I mean, you know, the simple writer biased answer is like, of course I want people to say nice stuff about my books. You know, kind of thing. So that's the simple off-the-cuff answer. The more complicated answer, I suppose, is that this kind of goes back to, which I suppose is why you asked the question, these questions about representation, particularly inside the publishing industry and things like that. So, you know, one of the things that happens far too frequently in the US is that books by people of color don't get reviewed. So, you know, these books kind of come out and they go out into the world and nobody hears anything about them. One of the great things, you know, there's a lot of terrible things to be said about social media, obviously, but one of the kind of not so bad things about social media is that it has created this kind of more egalitarian, inclusive conversation about books in places where the sort of major reviewers and things like that may not be paying enough attention to voices of writers who are writers of color, women writers, etc., transgender writers, queer writers, etc. There's this robust life for these books that can happen on social media in a way that it continues not to happen at all in the way that it should in the sort of mainstream sort of critical circles.
I mean, yeah, I think that's true, and it's an exciting moment for reviews. I feel like every book has flaws, but if it's published, it must have something that could also be highlighted. So the reviews that I'm most interested are usually mixed, and I feel like when I have a great review, I also learn something from it. As a writer, I always see myself as a work in progress. Like, I want to grow, I want to learn. I'm always trying to do something different than what I did before. So in some ways, you could tell when the critic is performing intelligence, but they don't completely always believe what they're saying because they're not great at the writing of a review. And that is really hard, right? Because then you're like, oh, people are taking this very seriously because it's being published in a publication as if the writer knows what they're doing or they're an authority. And that's always upsetting. But I do think that I try to learn from them. And I do think it's exciting how readers now just review books for each other because I think they're different people, right? Like people who read to be critics and people who read for pleasure are very different, I find, in the ways that they want or access books. And it's been very exciting to see readers' reviews, which comes from social media, right? They just write to me directly. They say, let me tell you what I think about your book. I didn't like it when this happened. And you know what? Bad ending. It upset me. I don't, this is the ending I would write. And that's exciting too. So I think there's like different levels of how we see criticisms and reviews.
There are also a lot of bloggers, vloggers on YouTube, many of them that review books on just a down low level.
I think, but very, very briefly, I think it's just something that I like to bring up because I think it's really important. So one of the things I think that happens sometimes when people have, not always, and in some channels it's getting better, as the people who review books is slowly becoming wider, like even professional reviewers, I mean now, not necessarily folks online, but professional reviewers, that field very slowly is becoming more inclusive as well. But before that began happening, and still very much, it's a great personal irritant of mine, is that sometimes books by people of color are reviewed purely on the basis of content. This book is about someone's sexuality. This book is about race, and we don't get the sort of, like, I can't tell you how many times I will go to a panel or do a whatever, and I'm almost never asked about artistry. I'm almost never asked about, I'm asked about like, well, what about black people in the South? And of course, that's deeply important. It's sort of my life's blood, to think about those things. But I'm also an artist, so I want to talk about that stuff too. And sometimes that gets left out of the conversation.
I'm a poet, not a fiction writer, and I think it is a different ecosystem for reviews for fiction writers and poets. I think poetry tends to get reviewed less. But I was thinking in particular of translations. Translations are often not reviewed, and when they are, the reviews are not about the translations themselves. And I translate from the Spanish. It can't be that hard to find a literary critic who can read the Spanish. But yet the review is based on the translation, of course, but without acknowledgement that there's an original. And this, the New and Selected got really good reviews, a handful. So I'm not complaining about the types of reviews I've received, but I've seen over and over again. It's like, okay, this is a book of translation. Why isn't this review dealing with the question of translation and how something is translated? And why hasn't the editor looked for someone who could read the original to then discuss the quality of the translation? Or not even the quality, it doesn't have to be critical in the sense of this is a bad translation, which is often like the knee-jerk review of just like, this is not a good translation, but talk about sort of the strategies of the translator. Like I want translations to really, have the critics who know how to talk about it. So I would say, I would say that, and it's true. My other tongue received more reviews or got more reviews than this book. But I think that overall in poetry, there tend to be very few bad reviews. Would you say that that's true? Because I think the argument is that not enough people read poetry anyway. Like, why waste your energy writing a bad review? What are you going to do with that? So I think you know, if someone really wants to write a review, and they're not going to get paid for it for the most part, unless it's like, you know, the New Yorker, why go out of your way to write something for no money, and, you know, to just pan it or say something terrible about it? So for the most part, you know, maybe some of that, you know, negative feedback comes, like you said, through social media or through other sources rather than through, you know, poetry reviews.
Oftentimes, even if a book of translation is reviewed, the translator, not only are they not talking about the craft and art of translation, but oftentimes the translator is not even mentioned, not in the title of the article and not within the body of an article. I myself had a book of translation reviewed in World Literature Today by a translator, herself a translator, from the language I translate from, the Persian, and she never even mentioned me. And when I mentioned this to her very amicably, she stopped talking to me. So
Yeah,
it's an endemic issue, you know?
But speaking on the power of social media, I think that's also, it's an interesting moment for translation, right? Because I think that social media has sort of pushed through, at least in fiction, I don't know what's happening in poetry, but Jennifer Croft, who won the Booker for translation, she literally said, why aren't the translators' names on the cover of books? And now there's been a commitment by a number of major presses to make sure that translators are on the cover of books. And that forces, I think, the conversation, because for many years it's been hidden. Isabel Allende has always been translated, for example, but to find the translator's name in her book, you need a microscope.
Yeah.
Because they've been trying to pass it as if it's not a translation. So what's exciting is that now translation, there's more space because of the prizes, and I think a lot of it has been kind of galvanized through social media and the masses, yeah.
I mean, ever since 25 years ago, or whenever, 20 years ago, when I started translating, there is a whole, just so you know, there is a whole subcommittee in the PEN Translation Committee that just writes publishers and writes letters to newspapers that do not mention the translator's name. That's a whole subcommittee.
I was going to say, I think that things are changing in terms of the visibility of the translator. I think partly it's because translators have begun to advocate for themselves, because they were sort of told that what you're doing is just hack work, right? You're just kind of performing a service. But I think there's visibility in, like you said, of people who are getting big awards, like Donmi Choi, you know, won the MacArthur, and she's a translator and poet. But I'm that person on Twitter, or I'm not on Twitter, on Instagram. You know, people will quote something that's been translated, right? Some inspirational quote from a poem, and I'll very innocently say, I really love what you just posted. Who's the translator? I would love to know who the translator is. And they'll say, oh, I don't know, I just got it from such and such. And that's the problem. It's seen as such a product. It's like posting a selfie or posting something else. Yes, someone made it, but I'm just using it now.
I do the same thing. I'm not sure if it's seen as necessarily a product, maybe that, but also as that the translation performs such a valuable and amazing job that you forget that it's originally written in a different language. You know, so, but, you know, yes, things have progressed. Christopher, would you like to address this question as well, or this question of, going back to Professor Sipuria's question about ruining lives based on literary criticism in totalitarian societies?
I'll just say what the late Marvin Bell once wrote in a poem, which I love. He said, we all know how many times a critic reads a book less than once. And a prominent poetry critic of the time quoted that in another review and got the quote wrong. He said, we all know how many times a critic reads a book not all the way through. And I thought, okay, that's it. But I just would say, even bad reviews are useful. I mean, I always feel like I learn something from reviews. And we have in America a famously savage poetry critic who I think he lies in his bathtub and just tries to think of all the ways in which he can destroy people. And once in the New York Times book review, he savaged three different poets, all well-known poets. And I called up one of them who's a good friend and said I was so sorry for the thrashing he had been given, and he said, I'm actually sort of charmed by this, that somebody would be that angry about my work, that he would be frothing at the mouth. That's comforting. So.
Thank you, Christopher. Irakli, do we have any time left for one more question, or should we be wrapping it up? Sorry? Absolutely. So thank you very much, everybody, for your wonderful attention, and thank you again, and welcome to our wonderful writers, Ayanna, Angie, Rozá, and Christopher. Thank you very much.